Hi, this is TheHande and welcome to another video where I talk about old video game stuff. And this time I decided I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my favorite video game composers. And I'm not going to talk about any particularly obscure or bizarre ones, but instead I'm just going to talk a little bit about three of my favorite video game composers: Koji Kondo, Michael Z. Land, and Robert Holmes. And let's start with the one that most of you have at least heard of, which is Koji Kondo. Koji Kondo, of course, has been and continues to be one of Nintendo's most prolific composers. He is, of course, most famous for having composed the music to most of the Mario games and quite a few installments in the Legend of Zelda series. Kondo is kind of considered the quintessential video game composer in the sense that he's able to take a very simple melody and work it in a way that even as you are having to listen to it for an extended period of time, you will never actually get bored with it. This is the reason why so many of the songs in the Super Mario series have stood the test of time. Now, one funny aspect about Kondo's compositions, though, which I have discovered in recent years, though, is that Kondo does have a history of liberally borrowing from pre-existing song pieces in a lot of his music. For instance, the sewer theme in the original Super Mario Bros. Borrows some bars from a pre-existing piece. But the one that kind of shocked me the most is the second overworld theme, aka the athletic theme from Super Mario World. Thomas Game Docs actually did a pretty good video on this one, because the opening bars of it are pretty directly ripped off from a 1960s pop song called Green Green, which is one of those weird cultural artifacts. It was a song that charted relatively low when it was originally released in North America, but then through a weird series of events ended up becoming quite popular in Japan in the 1960s, and apparently Kondo was so fond of this particular composition that he decided to utilize it when he had to work on the soundtrack for Super Mario World. Now, the song isn't like a direct ripoff, and you will notice that Kondo's version, for instance, plays quite a bit faster. One place also where you can hear Kondo's compositions, which I think gets unfairly overlooked a lot of the time, was in the Dick-produced Super Mario Bros. Super Show and its B-series, The Legend of Zelda. Equally legendary children's television show composer Shuki Levi reworked Kondo's compositions for those shows, and I think he actually did a fantastic job. Regardless of what your opinion of the Legend of Zelda cartoon, for instance, is, I think it has possibly one of the best soundtracks of any cartoon that I've listened to. Okay, next let's move on to Michael Z. Land, a name which you might not instantly recognize, but of course, if you have been watching my videos for any extended period of time, you will of course know this guy as the main composer for the Monkey Island series. Though I need to stress that at least an equal amount of the credit for the excellent soundtracks also goes to Peter McConnell, who was another LucasArts regular composer, and who after leaving LucasArts also went on to make the scores for several Tim Schafer games later down the line. Michael Land, however, I think has been kind of unfairly forgotten because he had a tendency of creating fairly complex and quite varied pieces of music for all the different games. I've seen in some interviews that Land apparently didn't like working at Skywalker Ranch because it made it difficult for him to get into a tropical enough of a mindset when he was trying to make the Monkey Island music. Now, my favorite Michael Land composition, obviously, is the main theme for the Monkey Island series, which you can hear at the start of literally every single one of the games. But the most complex composition that Land ever made was, surprisingly, the Woodtick Town theme from Monkey Island 2. Now, the melody in itself doesn't sound very complex, but the reason it was his and Peter McConnell's most complicated composition was because of the way the music functions within the game. Monkey Island 2 was the debut of LucasArts' in-house developed iMuse sound system, which allowed for a more natural blending of music as the player would move from one area to another, whereas in previous LucasArts adventure games, any area or scene that had music in the background would just kind of abruptly stop when the scene ended unless there was a programmed-in fade-out, such as in the case of the game Loop. In Monkey Island 2's case, every single location that you visit in the game uses the exact same background beat as the Woodtick theme, but as you enter the different businesses or exit them, different musical channels will open up, playing slightly different variations of the melody, thus maintaining continuity within the woodtick setting. If that sounds like needlessly complicated to program into a game, well, Land and McConnell were of the exact same mindset and swore that they would never ever do that again. Another fun Michael Land tidbit is that apparently when Jesse Harlan had to recreate the music for The Secret of Monkey Island Special Edition, he ran into a little bit of a problem with Elaine's theme because apparently the string section that opens up that particular part was playing notes that aren't actually possible to play on the violin, which is why Harlan had to downsize and change up the song a little bit in order to play the composition on real instruments, since the whole point of redoing the music was to redo it with actual instruments. And now, finally, let's talk about Robert Holmes, not to be confused with a musician by the same name. Robert Holmes is another video game composer that I don't think too many people necessarily recognize unless you were a huge fan of the Sierra adventure game series. And try not to act surprised, he was of course the composer for all three Gabriel Knight games. Not too surprising because he and Gabriel Knight's creator Jane Jensen would eventually end up getting married. Now, what I like about Robert Holmes' scores is that he has very dramatic melody sections, but he also did stylistically very different scores for each of the games. The first game, for instance, had a lot more jazzy and bluesy vibe to it, probably owing to the fact that the game was primarily set in New Orleans, while the music in the second game was a little bit more dramatic and orchestral, owing to it being set in Germany. The third game's soundtrack was a bit more contemporary. It had very heavy piano usage, but also kind of dramatic synth usage. In fact, I think the third game's soundtrack doesn't always get the recognition it deserves. It's certainly one of my favorite soundtracks, so I highly recommend going to listen to that. Now, I also have two fun stories about Robert Holmes's compositions. For one, I've already mentioned this in my super old Gabriel Knight series review. He basically had to create a part of an opera because the plotline of the second Gabriel Knight game involves a lost Wagner opera. Now, I don't know how faithful he was to Wagner in his actual composition, but in my opinion, that piece actually does sound very nice. What's also extra funny to me, though, is that Robert Holmes seems to have a particular soft spot for the song When the Saints Go Marching In, as you can hear a rendition of it in literally all of the three Gabriel Knight games. And that's all for me for now. I'm TheHande, see you on the next one.